Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. We've already seen how to access data in a different Access database. And one of the great strengths of newer versions of Access is the ability to access very many different data sources. Another very important option is the option to access ODBC data sources. That is Open Database Connectivity data sources, which are basically data sources that conform to the ODBC standard. Now, the basic principle behind ODBC is that if I set up my database to use an ODBC data source, such as perhaps Microsoft SQL Server, it's a very straightforward job to switch that source for a different ODBC data source, such as Oracle. And given the features of ODBC interconnectivity, the opposite is also true. If somebody has a database application that currently uses Oracle data via ODBC, it will be very straightforward for them to switch to use SQL Server instead. In terms of showing you how to do these things, we have two major problems. The first major problem is that you need an ODBC data source, and you may well not have one available to your installation of Access. If you do, then that's fine, you can use that. If you don't, what I'm going to cover in this section is, in outline at least, how to install SQL Server Express, which is basically a slightly cut down version of SQL Server that is freely available from Microsoft, and that will show you enough and provide you enough of the facilities of SQL Server that you can see how the use of ODBC data sources works with Access. If you have any reservations about installing SQL Server Express, or you don't want to for some reason, or you're not allowed to for some reason, then you can still follow along this section. You just won't be able to do the sort of practical side of it yourself. The second problem is that in order to show you properly how to use SQL Server, or in particular SQL Server Express, it will take quite a long time. So I'm going to have to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all of this, and if you find there are unanswered questions about SQL Server at the end of it, I'm afraid I'll have to leave you to look into those yourself. I do hope to cover enough about the installation and setup of SQL Server Express and how to load some data into it and how to then connect to it from Access that you'll be able to do that yourself, but I really will be concentrating on showing you just enough, and I won't have time to cover everything with a lot of breadth or a lot of depth. So let's set about getting a copy of SQL Server Express installed. It's available from Microsoft. I won't give you the exact link here because it does change from time to time, but if you search Microsoft.com for SQL Server Express, you will find an Express Edition page which includes a download button, which I'm going to use in just a moment. SQL Server Express Edition itself is actually just a cut down version of the larger edition, Standard and Enterprise. There's a limit of 4 gigabytes on the size of a database, but that's still twice as big as an Access database. It's free to use, and for small work groups, small numbers of users, it's absolutely fine. It will actually support a database application perfectly well on its own. So it's really great as a free piece of software. And if you need then subsequently to switch to the Standard Edition or the Enterprise Edition, it's actually very straightforward. Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition do have some functionality that isn't in Express, but it's probably not the most likely functionality that you'd use in a relatively small scale database application. In addition, there is now a local DB version of SQL Server Express that, instead of running as a service on the device you're using, actually runs in process with applications in general, and that's a good option as well for having a version of SQL Server that has quite a small footprint on your PC or whichever device you're running this on. So let's set about downloading and installing SQL Server Express. I'm going to run through this installation in outline. This is not intended to be a definitive set of instructions on how to install SQL Server Express. You get those from Microsoft.com. I'm just going to go through the main stages and show you how I'm installing it on this device. The first thing you'll need to know is whether you have a 32-bit or a 64-bit Windows operating system, Windows 7 or Windows 8. You'll need to be running Access 2013. On a Windows 8 machine, just check which version of the operating system you've got. If you go to the settings charm and look at PC info, it will tell you. If you're using Windows 7, then you can use the Start menu, and if you go into Control Panel, you can get System Info there, which will tell you which version of the operating system you're using. On this machine, I'm using a 64-bit version of Windows. So, click on Download SQL Server 2012 Express, and then you get a number of choices. At the moment, it's 5. The first choice is really the most popular one. This gives you SQL Server Express with the tools that includes LocalDB that I mentioned earlier, the database engine itself, and a number of management tools. Now, I'm going to install that first version, which has everything we need. But in fact, if all you wanted was a very simple version of SQL Server Express, the LocalDB version, with a straightforward Microsoft installer, then the third option gives you the smallest package of all. You can also just download the SQL Server Management Studio, the tools part alone, or indeed you can install a version of SQL Server Express that contains only the database engine. That's the last option. So you've got quite a range of options. I'm going to go with option 1. Then all I need to do is to choose my language. Remember, mine is the 64-bit version. I'm going to do this in English, and I click on Download, and then I just have to wait. There is a register option here to receive emails with access to the latest resources for SQL Server Express. You may find that useful, particularly if you're aiming to start to use SQL Server with access, or indeed without access. You will get some useful information from Microsoft if you register there. Now, due to my security setup, I get a warning down here. This website wants to install the following add-on, Akamai Download Manager for Akamai Technologies Inc. That's fine, that's the standard download manager, so I'm going to click on Install for that. And then after 1 or 2 more security warnings where I've just had to click yes at the appropriate time, I'm then asked where I'd like to save the installer package. If you look at the file name, at the time of recording this, it's SQL Express WT _x64 _enu.exe. I'm going to save it on my desktop. So I click on Save, and the download begins, and of course it'll run in the background and will carry on when that download has completed. Okay, the download has completed. Let's now launch the installer. So it prepares the installation files, and then the setup begins. And then eventually you're taken to the SQL Server Installation Center. Now, I should point out here that depending on the speed of your internet connection, it may have taken quite a time to download the installation package for SQL Server Express, and it may have taken quite a few minutes to unpack it and get to this point. So if things seem to be going quite slowly, you need to be quite patient, because this whole process can take quite a long time. However, when you do get to this point, choose New SQL Server Standalone Installation. The installation process continues. Setup continues some more. Then you're shown the Microsoft license agreement, and you need to accept the license terms. You may or may not agree to send feature usage data to Microsoft. I'm going to say not on this occasion. Click on Next. Given the option of including SQL Server product updates, which I'm going to accept at the moment. And whilst it's going about this setup, it will include those updates. So again, this may take a little while to perform as well. Now, I should point out, of course, that this whole process may have changed by the time you come to watch these videos. I'm pretty confident you'll still be able to get SQL Server Express, but the exact sequence of steps here may well change, and it's very important that you follow the procedure on Microsoft.com to check that it's still the same as it is here, And if there are some differences, follow the one on Microsoft.com. Okay, at last the last few files have been set up, and now I can choose the features of SQL Server Express that I want enabled. I'm going to enable everything, so there's a button down the bottom, Select All. And having gone for the default shared feature directory, I'm going to click on Next. Now, as I said earlier, I'm trying not to turn this into a course on SQL Server, but basically you can have multiple instances of SQL Server running on a machine, and if you only ever intend to have one instance, you can treat it as what's called the default instance, which is the top option here on this instance configuration screen. If there's a possibility that you're going to have more than one, then you need to name each instance, and the default name for the first instance is just SQL Express. That's the name that I'm going to accept here. I could put my own name in if I wanted to. I then choose an instant root directory. Again, I'm going to go for the default name for the instance root directory, and then I just click on Next. Now we have the server configuration page where we specify the service accounts and what's called the collation configuration. All you have to do here really is to accept the defaults and click on Next again. The database engine configuration page is almost a matter of accepting the defaults again, but you might want to just make sure that the SQL Server administration account is the Windows account that you're logged in with, which mine here certainly is. So again, pretty much accept the defaults. If for any reason your account name doesn't appear there, you can add yourself just by using Add Current User, and then you'll be added to the list of SQL Server administrators. But click on Next. You're then given the option of specifying that you want to send Windows and SQL Server error reports to Microsoft or your corporate report server. I'm going to leave that unchecked for the moment. Click on Next. And the final stages of installation do take a little while. Again, you'll just need to be patient. And there we are. After some further time, we have a complete message. Your SQL Server 2012 installation completed successfully, including product updates. So we now have a SQL Server database engine installed. We have the tools installed. We need some data, but as soon as we've got a bit of data loaded into SQL Server, we'll be able to access that from Access. So the next job is to find ourselves some data. Now fortunately there are a number of sample databases, free sample databases available for SQL Server, and one of the ones that's even linked to by Microsoft themselves is the one that's provided by CodePlex. It's the AdventureWorks database, and if you go to the CodePlex website and look for AdventureWorks, you'll find it. There is a version for SQL Server 2012. And it's a light version. It's that one there, AdventureWorks LT 2012_database.zip. Of course, if you've already had an earlier version of SQL Server installed on your device and you're using that, then if you haven't got a suitable sample database and you want one, just choose the appropriate one from the AdventureWorks list here. We're not actually going to look at that database in any great amount of detail. All I really want to do is show you how to access it from Access via SQL Server. But it's a good idea to have a sample database, and if we're all looking at the same one, that will help as well. So if you've just set up SQL Server Express, more or less in the way that I have, the LT 2012 version is the way to go. So click on the link. Do you want to open or save it? I'm going to say save because basically I like to keep these things saved in case anything goes wrong and I need to start again. Now I open that file, and what I have there is a pair of files, in this case an MDF file, which is a SQL Server database file, and an LDF file. You only really need the first one, so if you select the first one and click on unzip, I'm actually going to put it in my scratch folder for now. So click on unzip, and having unzipped it, there is the MDF file ready for me to use. So in the next section we're going to look at setting up that database, accessing that MDF file from SQL Server, and then in turn accessing that database from Microsoft Access. So please join me for that.